If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe for more. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 32 years old, and I never imagined that telling the truth would cost me everything I held dear. The lawsuit papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a somber-faced courier who apologized as he handed me the envelope that would shatter my world. $500,000. That's what my own family was demanding from me, claiming defamation, emotional distress, and destruction of their reputation, all because I refused to stay silent about what I witnessed that cold December night 3 years ago. I remember staring at those legal documents, my hands trembling as I read my mother's name listed as the primary plaintiff, followed by my father, my 2 brothers, and even my sister whom I'd protected my entire life. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very people who taught me about honesty and integrity were now trying to financially destroy me for practicing those values. My coffee grew cold as I sat at my kitchen table, reading accusation after accusation, each word feeling like a dagger to my heart. The story begins with my Uncle Robert, my father's younger brother, who had always been the golden child of our family, charming, successful, and seemingly perfect in every way. He owned a construction company that had made him wealthy beyond our wildest dreams. Every family gathering revolved around his achievements, his new cars, his luxurious vacations. I watched my parents beam with pride whenever they talked about him, often comparing my modest, teaching salary to his empire with thinly veiled disappointment. What they didn't know was that I had discovered the dark truth behind his success. Working late at my school one evening, I had decided to take a shortcut through the construction site where Uncle Robert's company was building our new gymnasium. The night was eerily quiet, and I noticed unusual activity near the foundation. Men in hard hats were working under bright portable lights, but something felt wrong about the scene. Their movements were hurried, almost frantic, and they kept looking over their shoulders as if expecting to be caught. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crept closer, hiding behind a pile of construction materials. What I witnessed that night would haunt me forever. They were dumping barrels of what appeared to be toxic waste into the foundation, sealing it with concrete before anyone could discover their crime. The chemicals had a pungent smell that made my eyes water and my throat burn. I watched in horror as they covered their tracks, knowing that hundreds of children would soon be walking over this contaminated ground every day. My first instinct was to call the police, but these weren't just any workers. I recognized several faces, including Uncle Robert himself, directing the operation with the cold efficiency of someone who had done this before. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was how he had built his fortune, by cutting corners and disposing of hazardous materials illegally, putting countless lives at risk. I spent sleepless nights wrestling with my conscience, knowing that speaking up would destroy my family's unity but understanding that my silence would make me complicit in potentially poisoning an entire generation of students. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on me like a physical burden, affecting my appetite, my sleep, and my ability to look my relatives in the eye during family gatherings. The decision to come forward wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I contacted the Environmental Protection Agency, providing them with detailed accounts of what I had witnessed. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough, revealing a pattern of illegal dumping that spanned over a decade. Uncle Robert's empire crumbled overnight, facing millions in fines and criminal charges that would send him to prison for 15 years. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within hours of the news breaking, my phone began ringing incessantly. My mother's voice was barely recognizable through her tears and rage when she called me a traitor, demanding to know how I could destroy our family's reputation. My father's disappointment cut deeper than any anger could have, his quiet words about loyalty and family bonds echoing in my ears long after he hung up. My siblings formed a united front against me, each conversation ending with accusations and ultimatums. Extended family rallied around Uncle Robert, painting me as a vindictive, jealous woman who couldn't stand to see her uncle's success. They whispered about my failed marriage, my modest income, my childlessness, using every personal detail as ammunition to discredit my character. Family friends stopped inviting me to gatherings, and even my own cousins crossed the street to avoid speaking to me. The isolation was suffocating, wrapping around me like a shroud that grew heavier with each passing day. What hurt most was watching my family's desperate attempts to minimize the damage. They hired expensive lawyers, launched a public relations campaign, and even suggested that I had somehow misunderstood what I had witnessed. My mother appeared on local news, tears streaming down her face as she defended her brother-in-law, questioned my mental stability. She spoke about my recent divorce, suggesting that emotional trauma had clouded my judgment, turning me into an unreliable witness seeking attention. The legal battle began almost immediately. Uncle Robert's lawyers argued that my testimony was hearsay, that I had no scientific training to identify toxic materials, and that my personal grudges had motivated false accusations. They dissected every aspect of my life, from my college grades to my teaching evaluations, searching for anything that might discredit my character. The stress of constant scrutiny began affecting my work, and I found myself making mistakes in the classroom that I had never made before. My principal called me into her office on a Friday afternoon, her expression grave as she explained that several parents had complained about my involvement in the scandal. They didn't want their children taught by someone who had torn apart her own family, regardless of the truth behind my actions. The irony was crushing. I had risked everything to protect children from toxic exposure, only to be told that I was now considered a threat to their well-being. The school board meeting was a nightmare I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. Parents stood up one by one, demanding my resignation, questioning my judgment, and painting me as a vindictive woman who couldn't be trusted with their children's education. I sat in the back row, listening to character assassination after character assassination, feeling my career slip away with each spoken word. The board voted to place me on administrative leave pending a full investigation, effectively ending my teaching career. Meanwhile, Uncle Robert's criminal case proceeded through the courts, with my testimony serving as the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The evidence was overwhelming. Soil samples confirmed toxic contamination. Company records revealed a pattern of illegal dumping, and several former employees came forward with their own testimonies. Yet my family continued to stand by him, raising money for his legal defense and treating me as if I were the criminal. The emotional toll was devastating. I began seeing a therapist, trying to process the grief of losing my entire family while simultaneously dealing with the guilt of destroying lives, even if those lives had been built on illegal foundations. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that I was experiencing a form of complicated grief, mourning relationships that weren't dead but had been fundamentally altered by my choice to speak the truth. Sleep became elusive, replaced by nightmares where I was back at that construction site, watching the toxic waste being poured into the foundation. Sometimes, I dreamed about the children who would have been exposed, imagining their faces as they developed mysterious illnesses years later. Other nights, I dreamed about my family, seeing the disappointment in their eyes and feeling the weight of their rejection crushing my chest until I woke up gasping for air. The lawsuit papers arrived exactly 6 months after Uncle Robert's conviction. My family had waited just long enough for the criminal proceedings to conclude before launching their civil attack against me. The timing was strategic and calculated, designed to maximize both financial and emotional damage. They claimed that my testimony had been unnecessary, that I could have handled the situation quietly within the family, sparing them the public humiliation and financial ruin that followed. Reading through the legal documents, I was struck by the intimate knowledge my family's lawyers possessed about my personal life. They had documented every aspect of my divorce, my therapy sessions, my declining job performance, and even my medical history. The invasion of privacy felt like a second violation, as if they were stripping away the last vestiges of my dignity. In their quest for revenge, they painted a picture of an unstable woman driven by jealousy and spite. Someone who had weaponized environmental concerns to destroy a successful family member. The financial implications were staggering. $500,000 represented more than 10 years of my teaching salary. Money I simply didn't have and couldn't hope to earn. They knew this, of course. The lawsuit wasn't really about money. It was about punishment, about making sure I understood the consequences of choosing truth over family loyalty. My own parents were willing to bankrupt me to prove a point. And that realization cut deeper than any legal threat could. I struggled to find legal representation, as many lawyers in our small town had either worked with Uncle Robert's construction company or had family connections that created conflicts of interest. The few attorneys who would take my case demanded retainers I couldn't afford, leaving me scrambling to understand complex legal procedures on my own. The local law library became my second home as I researched defamation law, environmental regulations, and civil procedure, trying to build a defense with no formal training. My former colleagues at school treated me like a pariah, their awkward, silences and averted eyes, speaking volumes about my altered status in the community. The teacher's lounge conversations died when I entered, replaced by uncomfortable throat clearing and sudden urgent business elsewhere. Even my closest friend, Jennifer, who had stood by me through my divorce, began making excuses to avoid spending time together. The social isolation was complete and suffocating. The media attention intensified as the lawsuit progressed. Local news stations ran stories about the family torn apart by environmental activism, interviewing my relatives who spoke tearfully about betrayal and broken trust. They presented Uncle Robert as a victim of overzealous regulation and family dysfunction, his illegal activities minimized while my role as whistleblower was portrayed as vindictive and destructive. The narrative they constructed painted me as the villain in a story where I had tried to be the hero. My physical health began deteriorating under the constant stress. I lost weight I couldn't afford to lose, my hair began falling out in clumps, and chronic headaches made concentration nearly impossible. The family doctor I had seen for years refused to continue treating me, citing the awkward situation with my relatives who were also his patients. Finding new medical care became another challenge in a life already overwhelmed by obstacles. The deposition process was particularly brutal. My family's lawyers grilled me for hours, asking the same questions repeatedly, trying to find inconsistencies in my testimony. They questioned my memory, my motives, my mental state, and my relationship with each family member. The conference room felt like an interrogation chamber, with my own mother sitting across from me, her face a mask of cold determination I had never seen before. Uncle Robert's conviction should have vindicated my decision to speak out, but instead, it seemed to intensify my family's anger. They blamed me for his 15-year prison sentence, the collapse of his business, and the financial hardship that affected everyone connected to his company. Several cousins lost their jobs when the construction company folded, and their wives made sure I knew about their children's struggles and their mortgage payments they could no longer afford. The community response was mixed but generally hostile. Uncle Robert had employed dozens of local workers and contributed generously to community projects, making him a beloved figure whose fall from grace was seen as a tragedy rather than justice. People blamed me for destroying jobs and damaging the town's economy, conveniently forgetting that his illegal activities had put their own children at risk. Part 4. The preliminary hearing for the civil case took place on a gray October morning that seemed to match the bleakness of my situation. I sat alone at the defendant's table, having finally managed to secure legal representation through a public interest law firm that specialized in whistleblower protection. My attorney, David Chen, was young and idealistic, driven by a passion for environmental justice that reminded me why I had spoken out in the first place. Across the courtroom, my family filled 2 entire rows, their unified presence a stark reminder of my isolation. My mother refused to make eye contact, her face set in lines of permanent disappointment that had aged her beyond her years. My father's shoulders were stooped with the weight of public shame, and I could see how the stress had affected his health. My siblings sat rigidly, their expressions ranging from anger to sadness, but all reflecting the same fundamental rejection of my choices. The judge, an elderly woman named Patricia Hendricks, listened impassively as both sides presented their opening arguments. My family's lawyer, a polished man in an expensive suit, painted me as a vindictive whistleblower who had destroyed innocent lives for personal gain. He argued that I had multiple avenues to address my concerns privately, that my decision to go public had been motivated by malice rather than genuine environmental concern. David's response was passionate and well-researched, citing numerous cases where environmental whistleblowers had faced similar family persecution. He argued that my actions had potentially saved hundreds of children from toxic exposure, that the public interest in environmental protection far outweighed any damage to my family's reputation. His words rang with conviction, but I could see the skepticism in the judge's eyes as she looked at me sitting alone while my entire family united against me. The first witness was my mother, her testimony delivered with the practiced grief of someone who had been rehearsing her pain for months. She spoke about the family's reputation, the community standing we had enjoyed for generations, and the devastating impact of my betrayal on their social and economic status. Her words were carefully chosen, designed to evoke sympathy while painting me as a cold, calculating destroyer of family bonds. Listening to my mother testify against me was one of the most painful experiences of my life. This was the woman who had taught me about right and wrong, who had raised me to stand up for what I believed in, now condemning me for doing exactly that. The betrayal cut both ways. She felt I had betrayed the family, while I felt she had betrayed the values she had instilled in me. The courtroom became a battleground for competing definitions of loyalty and morality. My father's testimony was briefer but equally devastating. He spoke about the financial impact of Uncle Robert's conviction, the loans they had guaranteed for his business, the investments they had lost when his company collapsed. His voice cracked as he described the humiliation of facing neighbors and friends, the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered rooms, the gradual erosion of relationships that had defined his social life for decades. The most heartbreaking moment came when my sister took the stand. Lisa had always been my closest family member, the one person I thought might understand my decision. Instead, she spoke about the therapy she had required to deal with the family trauma, the way her own children had been ostracized at school because of their association with me. She detailed the counseling sessions, the anxiety medication, the sleepless nights spent wondering how our family had fallen apart so completely. Each testimony felt like a physical blow, forcing me to confront the real human cost of my decision. These weren't abstract concepts of environmental protection versus family loyalty. These were specific, measurable damages inflicted on people I loved. The guilt was overwhelming, even as I knew that staying silent would have been morally indefensible. The complexity of the situation defied simple moral calculations. The expert witnesses presented conflicting views of my actions. My family's psychologist testified about the trauma inflicted on families when members become whistleblowers, describing a pattern of broken relationships and psychological damage. The environmental scientist David had retained countered with evidence of the long-term health risks I had prevented, the potential cancer clusters and developmental disabilities that had been averted by my intervention. The defense phase of the trial began with my own testimony, a moment I had been dreading for months. Taking the stand felt like standing before a firing squad, with my family's hostile stares boring into me from across the courtroom. David guided me through the events of that December night, helping me recreate the scene that had changed everything. My voice shook as I described the toxic waste being poured into the foundation, the casual way the workers had discussed their illegal dumping, the realization that children would soon be walking over contaminated ground. The cross-examination was brutal and personal. My family's attorney dissected every aspect of my life, from my failed marriage to my modest career achievements, suggesting that jealousy and personal inadequacy had motivated my actions. He questioned my ability to identify toxic materials, my memory of events that had occurred years earlier, and my mental state during the period following my divorce. Each question felt designed to humiliate rather than elicit truth. The most painful moment came when he asked me to look at my family and explain why I had chosen to destroy their lives. The question was objected to and sustained, but the damage was done. I found myself staring at the people who had raised me, loved me, and supported me through every challenge of my life, now united in their determination to see me financially ruined. The weight of their collective disappointment was crushing. David called several character witnesses, including former students and colleagues who testified about my integrity and dedication to child welfare. Their support was touching but felt inadequate against the overwhelming testimony of my own family. Dr. Martinez, my therapist, testified about the psychological toll of whistleblowing, explaining how the isolation and rejection I had experienced were typical responses to choosing principle over relationships. The environmental impact expert provided crucial testimony about the long-term consequences of the toxic waste I had discovered. She explained how the chemicals would have gradually leached into the groundwater, potentially affecting the entire school district's water supply. Her projections about cancer rates and developmental disabilities were sobering, reminding everyone present of the stakes involved in my decision to speak out. The final witness was a former employee of Uncle Robert's company who had come forward only after his conviction. Marcus Rodriguez testified about the culture of illegal dumping that had existed for years, confirming that my uncle had regularly disposed of hazardous materials at school and playground construction sites. His testimony should have vindicated my actions, but I could see that my family viewed him as another traitor, someone who had betrayed their beloved patriarch during the closing arguments. My family's lawyer painted a picture of a vengeful woman who had destroyed innocent lives to satisfy her own psychological needs. He argued that even if Uncle Robert had been guilty of environmental crimes, I had multiple ways to address the situation without destroying my family's reputation and financial security. The lawsuit, he claimed, was about accountability and consequences, about making sure that vindictive actions had appropriate costs. David's closing argument was passionate and comprehensive, weaving together environmental law, whistleblower protection, and moral philosophy. He reminded the jury that I had potentially saved hundreds of children from toxic exposure, that my actions had uncovered a pattern of illegal dumping that had endangered entire communities. He argued that punishing me for doing the right thing would send a chilling message to other potential whistleblowers, that family loyalty could never justify environmental destruction. The jury deliberated for 3 days, their extended discussion suggesting the complexity of the case and the conflicting values at stake. I spent those 72 hours in a state of suspended animation, unable to eat, sleep, or concentrate on anything except the impending verdict. The financial implications were staggering, but the emotional stakes were even higher. A verdict against me would validate my family's rejection, confirming that I had chosen wrongly when I decided to speak out. When the jury returned, their faces were grave and unreadable. The foreman, a middle-aged man who had avoided eye contact throughout the trial, stood to deliver the verdict. The courtroom fell silent as he read the jury's decision, his words carrying the weight of months of legal battle and years of family destruction. The verdict was a partial victory that felt like complete defeat. The jury found that while I had acted within my rights as a whistleblower, my family had suffered genuine damages from my actions. They awarded them $100,000, a sum that was devastating to my finances but felt like vindication of their position. The judge's comments from the bench were measured but clearly sympathetic to my family's plight, acknowledging the difficult balance between environmental protection and family loyalty. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt the weight of legal defeat settling over me like a burial shroud. My family celebrated their victory with subdued satisfaction, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and continued anger. There were no congratulations or reconciliation attempts, just the cold acknowledgement that they had successfully punished me for my betrayal. The distance between us felt permanent and unbridgeable. The media coverage of the verdict was mixed, with environmental groups hailing it as a victory for whistleblower protection while local news portrayed it as validation of my family's suffering. The complex legal nuances were lost in simplified narratives about family loyalty versus environmental activism. I found myself becoming a symbol for competing values, a cautionary tale about the costs of doing the right thing. The financial impact was immediate and severe. $100,000 represented more than 3 years of my teaching salary, money I would have to pay from resources I simply didn't possess. My modest savings account was depleted within weeks, and I faced the prospect of selling my house to satisfy the judgment. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had sacrificed my career and family relationships to protect children from toxic exposure, only to find myself financially destroyed by the very people I had tried to protect. Finding new employment proved nearly impossible. The notoriety of the case had made me unemployable in education, with school districts viewing me as a liability rather than an asset. My background checks revealed the lawsuit, the media coverage, and the family conflict, making administrators reluctant to hire someone who might bring unwanted attention to their institutions. The teaching career I had built over 15 years was effectively over. Eventually found work as a substitute teacher in a district 50 miles away, taking whatever assignments were available and earning a fraction of my previous salary. The commute was exhausting, the work was inconsistent, and the pay was barely enough to cover basic expenses. I felt like a ghost of my former self, professionally and personally diminished by the consequences of my moral choice. The isolation deepened as months passed without any contact from my family. Birthdays, holidays, and family milestones occurred without acknowledgement or invitation. I watched from afar as my nieces and nephews grew up without knowing their aunt, as my parents aged without my support, as my siblings navigated life challenges without my input. The family structure that had defined my identity for 32 years had been permanently altered by my decision to speak out. Therapy became my lifeline during this period, providing a safe space to process the complex emotions surrounding my situation. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that I was experiencing disenfranchised grief, mourning relationships that weren't dead but had been fundamentally changed. The loss was real and painful, but it was also different from death, carrying the additional burden of potential reconciliation that seemed simultaneously possible and impossible. The appeals process dragged on for months, with David arguing that the damages award was excessive and unsupported by evidence. my family's lawyers countered that the amount was actually insufficient to compensate for the long-term damage to their reputations and relationships. The legal bills continued mounting, adding to my financial burden and extending the emotional torture of remaining connected to people who had rejected me. Uncle Robert's imprisonment provided a strange form of validation for my actions. His conviction had been upheld on appeal, and investigative reports revealed that his illegal dumping had affected multiple sites across the region. Children's health studies conducted at the schools where he had worked showed elevated rates of respiratory problems and developmental delays, confirming the dangers I had tried to prevent. Yet, this vindication felt hollow when weighed against the personal costs I had paid. The appeals court decision arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 years after the original verdict. I opened the envelope with trembling hands, expecting another legal setback that would deepen my financial obligations. Instead, I found a comprehensive ruling that overturned the damages award and vindicated my actions as a whistleblower. The 3-judge panel had found that my family's lawsuit was fundamentally flawed, that environmental protection superseded family loyalty, and that punishing me for reporting criminal activity would create a dangerous precedent. The legal victory felt surreal after years of defeat and isolation. David called me immediately, his voice filled with excitement as he explained the implications of the ruling. Not only were the damages eliminated, but the court had ordered my family to pay my legal fees, a sum that exceeded $50,000. The tables had turned completely, transforming me from debtor to creditor in the family's financial obligations. The media coverage of the appeals decision was extensive and largely positive. Environmental groups celebrated the ruling as a landmark victory for whistleblower protection, while legal experts praised the court's recognition of the public interest in environmental safety. My story became a case study in law schools, an example of how moral courage could ultimately prevail over family pressure and community hostility. Yet the legal vindication felt hollow when measured against the personal costs I had endured. My family's reaction to the appeals decision was predictably hostile, with my mother issuing a statement to local media, expressing disappointment in the judicial system and reaffirming their belief that I had betrayed fundamental family values. The financial reversal didn't heal the emotional wounds or restore the relationships I had lost. The years of stress and isolation had taken their toll on my physical and mental health. I had developed chronic anxiety, struggled with depression, and experienced physical symptoms including persistent headaches and digestive problems. The victory in court provided intellectual satisfaction but couldn't undo the physiological damage of prolonged stress and social rejection. Recovery would be a long process requiring continued therapy and medical attention. Professional rehabilitation proved challenging despite my legal vindication. The education community remained wary of hiring someone associated with such public controversy, regardless of the ultimate legal outcome. I eventually found work with an environmental advocacy group, using my teaching skills to develop educational programs about toxic waste and community health. The salary was modest, but the work felt meaningful and aligned with my values. The most unexpected development was the emergence of other whistleblowers who had faced similar family persecution. My story had apparently inspired others to come forward with their own experiences of environmental violations, creating a network of people who understood the unique challenges of choosing principle over family loyalty. These connections provided emotional support and practical advice for navigating the complex aftermath of moral courage. Dr. Martinez and I spent considerable time processing the complex emotions surrounding my legal victory. The vindication was gratifying, but it couldn't restore the family relationships that had been permanently damaged. She helped me understand that closure might not involve reconciliation with my family, that healing could occur independently of their forgiveness or acceptance. The concept of moving forward without their approval was both liberating and terrifying. The financial recovery from my legal victory provided stability I hadn't experienced in years. I was able to keep my house, pay off accumulated debts, and establish a modest emergency fund. The money from my family's court-ordered payment of my legal fees felt like poetic justice, though I took no satisfaction in their financial burden. The reversal of fortunes was complete, but brought no joy, only a sense of exhausted relief. My relationship with the broader community began to improve as the appeals decision received positive coverage. People who had previously shunned me started acknowledging my presence, and some even offered belated support for my actions. The social rehabilitation was gradual and incomplete, but it represented progress toward a more normal existence. I was no longer the pariah who had destroyed a beloved family business, but rather a vindicated whistleblower who had protected community health. Part 8. 3 years after the appeals decision, I received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. My nephew Jamie, Lisa's youngest son, had been diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia that doctors suspected might be linked to environmental toxins. The irony was devastating. The very health problems I had tried to prevent were now affecting my own family, despite my efforts to protect them. Lisa's voice was broken as she asked if I thought there might be a connection to Uncle Robert's illegal dumping. The conversation was awkward and painful, our first real communication in over 5 years. Lisa's anger toward me had softened in the face of her child's illness, replaced by desperate concern for his health and mounting questions about environmental factors that might have contributed to his condition. She wanted to know everything about the toxic waste I had discovered, the chemicals that had been dumped, and the potential health implications for children in our community. I spent hours researching the connection between the specific chemicals Uncle Robert had dumped in childhood leukemia, finding disturbing correlations that suggested Jamie's illness might indeed be related to environmental contamination. The scientific literature was filled with studies linking toxic waste exposure to various cancers, particularly in children whose developing systems were more vulnerable to chemical damage. The guilt was overwhelming, wondering if I could have done more to prevent this tragedy. Working with environmental health experts, I helped Lisa document Jamie's potential exposure to the contaminated sites where Uncle Robert had dumped his waste. The analysis revealed that several of the chemicals found in soil samples from those locations were known carcinogens with established links to childhood leukemia. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, suggesting that my nephew's illness might be a direct result of the crimes I had exposed years earlier. The medical battle for Jamie's life became a family rallying point that transcended our previous conflicts. Lisa reached out to me for support, recognizing that my environmental knowledge and connections with health advocates could benefit her son's treatment. For the first time in years, I felt needed by my family, though the circumstances were heartbreaking. My expertise in toxic exposure, gained through years of studying Uncle Robert's crimes, now served to help save my nephew's life. The treatment process was grueling and expensive, requiring specialized care that strained Lisa's resources. I offered to help financially, using money from my legal settlement to support Jamie's medical expenses. The gesture was small compared to the magnitude of his illness, but it represented a step toward healing the fractured relationships that had defined our family for so many years. Lisa's gratitude was mixed with continued sadness about our lost connection. Other families in our community began reaching out as news of Jamie's diagnosis spread. Several children who had attended schools where Uncle Robert had worked were experiencing similar health problems, creating a cluster of cases that suggested widespread environmental contamination. The issue I had raised years earlier was now manifesting in the most tragic way possible, vindicating my warnings while confirming my worst fears about the consequences of staying silent. A class action lawsuit emerged from the growing number of affected families, with lawyers arguing that Uncle Robert's illegal dumping had created a public health crisis that continued to affect children years after his conviction. I was asked to serve as a key witness, my original testimony becoming crucial evidence in establishing the timeline and scope of the contamination. The legal process was familiar but emotionally devastating, as I watched families deal with the consequences of environmental crimes I had tried to prevent. The media attention surrounding the health crisis was intense and often intrusive. Reporters wanted to interview me about my prescient warnings, painting me as a heroic figure who had tried to prevent the tragedy now unfolding. The praise felt hollow when measured against the suffering of sick children and devastated families. I had been right about the dangers, but being right provided no comfort when facing the reality of children fighting for their lives. My relationship with Lisa gradually improved as we worked together to support Jamie's treatment and advocate for other affected families. The shared crisis created a bond that transcended our previous conflicts, though the underlying tension about my original decision remained. She acknowledged that I had been right about the dangers, but she also continued to believe that I could have handled the situation differently, perhaps preventing both the family destruction and the current health crisis. The complexity of our reconciliation reflected the broader moral ambiguity of the situation. I had made the right choice in exposing Uncle Robert's crimes, but the consequences had been devastating for everyone involved. My family had suffered financially and emotionally, while the community had endured a public health crisis that might have been prevented if I had acted differently. The simple narrative of good versus evil had given way to a more complex understanding of unintended consequences and moral complexity. Part 9. Jamie's treatment showed promising results after months of intensive chemotherapy, giving our family hope that hadn't existed in years. The medical team attributed his positive response partly to the early detection made possible by our environmental investigation, suggesting that my involvement had actually helped save his life. The irony was profound. The expertise I had gained from exposing Uncle Robert's crimes had now become crucial to treating my nephew's illness. The class action lawsuit against Uncle Robert's estate and insurance companies resulted in a substantial settlement that provided medical care for affected families and funding for environmental cleanup efforts. My testimony was crucial in establishing the timeline of contamination and the scope of health impacts, transforming me from family pariah to key witness in securing justice for the community. The legal victory felt different from my previous court battles, focused on healing rather than punishment. As Jamie's health improved, other family members began reaching out tentatively, testing the waters for possible reconciliation. My father called on my birthday for the first time in 5 years, his voice uncertain but warm as he asked about my life and work. The conversation was brief and awkward, but it represented a crack in the wall of rejection that had surrounded me for so long. These small gestures of connection felt precious after years of isolation. My mother remained the most resistant to reconciliation, her anger and disappointment still burning bright after all these years. She viewed my involvement in Jamie's treatment as opportunistic, another attempt to insert myself into family affairs where I wasn't wanted. Her hostility was painful but understandable, representing years of accumulated grief and anger that couldn't be easily resolved through a single health crisis or legal victory. The environmental advocacy work I had embraced after my legal victory became increasingly meaningful as the community health crisis unfolded. My organization played a crucial role in coordinating medical care for affected families, advocating for government intervention, and ensuring that similar contamination didn't occur elsewhere. The work felt like a natural extension of my original decision to speak out, transforming personal trauma into public service. Dr. Martinez and I spent considerable time processing the complex emotions surrounding my family's gradual reconciliation. The healing process was neither linear nor complete, with setbacks and breakthroughs occurring unpredictably. Some family members were ready to move forward, while others remained locked in old patterns of anger and rejection. I had to accept that reconciliation might be partial and imperfect, that some relationships might never fully heal. The broader community's attitude toward me had shifted dramatically as the health crisis revealed the prescience of my original warnings. People who had shunned me for years now sought my expertise and advice, recognizing that my environmental knowledge could help protect their families. The transformation from pariah to expert was gratifying but also highlighted the arbitrary nature of public opinion and social acceptance. Uncle Robert's death in prison brought unexpected closure to the long saga of family destruction and community contamination. His passing removed the central figure around whom our family conflicts had revolved, creating space for healing that hadn't existed while he lived. The funeral was a complex emotional event, with family members processing years of conflicted feelings about a man who had been both beloved uncle and environmental criminal. My relationship with Lisa deepened as we worked together to support Jamie's recovery and advocate for other affected families. We spent hours discussing the events that had torn our family apart, gradually developing a more nuanced understanding of the choices we had all made. While she never fully endorsed my original decision to go public, she acknowledged that my actions had ultimately helped save her son's life. The financial settlements from the class action lawsuit provided resources for extensive environmental cleanup and long-term health monitoring for affected families. The contaminated sites were remediated, using advanced techniques that hadn't been available when I first discovered the illegal dumping. The community's investment in environmental protection represented a positive legacy emerging from years of tragedy and conflict. As Jamie's treatment concluded successfully, our family began tentatively planning our first gathering in over 6 years. The prospect of sitting around a dinner table with people who had sued me and rejected me was both thrilling and terrifying. The relationships would never be the same as before, but they might evolve into something new, and perhaps more honest than what we had previously shared. Part 10. The family dinner took place on a Sunday afternoon in early spring. 6 months after Jamie's doctors declared his cancer in remission. The gathering was small and tentative, with only Lisa, Jamie, and my father present. My mother had declined the invitation, her anger still too raw for reconciliation. The absence of other family members spoke to the ongoing divisions that might never fully heal. But the presence of those who had come represented hope for rebuilding something from the ruins of our relationships. Jamie had grown taller during his treatment, his once pale complexion now healthy and vibrant. Seeing him laugh and play felt like a miracle after months of uncertainty about his survival. His recovery represented more than just medical success. It symbolized the possibility of healing from trauma and moving forward despite devastating setbacks. The boy who had suffered because of his great-uncle's crimes was now thriving. His resilience, a testament to the human capacity for recovery. The conversation around the dinner table was careful and measured, each of us navigating the complex emotions that had defined our family for years. Lisa spoke about her gratitude for my involvement in Jamie's treatment, acknowledging that my environmental expertise had been crucial to his early diagnosis and successful therapy. My father admitted that he had been wrong to completely cut me off, that family loyalty should never have required ignoring criminal behavior that endangered children. Yet the reconciliation was incomplete and fragile. My mother's absence hung over the gathering like a shadow, her continued rejection a reminder of the permanent damage that had been done to our family structure. Some of my siblings remained estranged, their anger undiminished by time or changed circumstances. The legal victory, the health crisis, and the successful treatment hadn't erased the fundamental disagreement about my original decision to speak out. The environmental cleanup efforts in our community had become a model for other contaminated sites, with federal agencies using our experience to develop better protocols for addressing toxic waste dumping. My role as a consultant and advocate had grown beyond our local situation, with speaking engagements and consulting opportunities that provided both income and purpose. The work felt like a natural evolution of my original decision to prioritize public health over family harmony. Dr. Martinez and I celebrated the progress I had made in therapy, acknowledging the long journey from isolation and rejection to tentative reconciliation and professional fulfillment. The healing process had been neither quick nor complete, but it had been real and meaningful. I had learned to find validation internally rather than depending on family approval, a lesson that had been painful but ultimately liberating. The financial security provided by my legal settlements and consulting work had allowed me to establish a scholarship fund for children affected by environmental contamination. The program provided educational opportunities for young people whose families had been impacted by toxic waste, creating positive outcomes from tragic circumstances. Jamie was among the first recipients, his college education funded by money that had originally been intended to punish me for speaking out. As the dinner concluded, Lisa asked me to stay in touch more regularly, to be part of Jamie's life as he grew into adulthood. The invitation was tentative but genuine, representing a bridge between our damaged past and uncertain future. We would never return to the innocent family relationships we had once shared, but we might build something new and perhaps more honest than what we had lost. Walking to my car after the dinner, I reflected on the long journey from that December night when I first witnessed Uncle Robert's illegal dumping to this moment of tentative reconciliation. The cost had been enormous in terms of relationships, career, and personal well-being, but the alternative of staying silent would have been morally indefensible. The children who had been protected from toxic exposure, including Jamie, whose illness had been caught early, represented the true measure of my decision's value. The lawsuit that had once threatened to destroy me financially had ultimately led to a larger legal victory that provided justice for an entire community. The family relationships that had been shattered by my whistleblowing were slowly healing, though they would never be the same as before. The simple moral choice I had made years earlier had created consequences that continued to unfold, shaping not just my own life but the lives of countless others.